He'd lost his family, his land, and nearly his life. But when a stranger offered him her home, she wasn't just giving him a roof, she was begging not to be alone. The wind rolled low and mean through the dying grass as the man crested the hill, nothing but dust trailing behind his boots. His coat was sun-faded and fraying at the seams, his hat slumped low over a face that hadn't seen a mirror in weeks. There was no horse, no satchel, no weapon in sight, only the worn boots of a man who had clearly walked farther than any man should have. When he stepped into the outskirts of Drybell, no one came to greet him. But eyes watched from behind saloon windows and cracked barn doors, whispering about the way he moved, slow, deliberate, like someone carrying too much loss in his bones. He didn't speak. Not when the boy at the general store offered him water. Not when old Miss Beasley gasped and said, "Ain't that the McAllister boy?" If he heard them, he gave no sign. He only nodded once, absently, and kept walking. The town of Drybell had seen its share of lost men. Drifters, thieves, bounty hunters pretending not to be. But this one was different. He had no edge, no swagger, no glint of violence in his eye. He looked like a man who had already died once, and maybe hadn't noticed yet. By midday he was sitting on the edge of the well in the center of town. Children kept their distance but couldn't stop staring. One girl whispered, "Why's he look like that?" Her mother shushed her quickly, pulling her close. Another man older leaned over and muttered to the blacksmith, "Ain't that the cowboy who lost his ranch last spring? Heard his whole spread burned in a storm, heard his wife died with it." The blacksmith only shrugged. "Looks like he lost more than a roof." As the sun climbed high, the cowboy moved again, still silent, still distant, until he reached the chapel steps. He sat there for a while, head bowed, not praying, not moving, just sitting. Like maybe God owed him a word and he was tired of waiting for it. The preacher stepped outside to offer him bread and a place to rest. The man looked up with tired eyes and shook his head. Then he walked on, heading out of town again, no one quite knew where. Drybell was the last dust-blown town for 30 miles in every direction. Beyond it were wild hills, forgotten ranches, broken fences. If a man walked that way, he wasn't looking to be found. The sun began to dip low, casting the sky in burnt gold and rose. Coyotes howled in the distance and the grass hissed beneath the wind. He moved with a limp now, the weight of exhaustion dragging at every step. And still he said nothing. To the town, to the world, to whatever voice inside him once spoke. He passed the old Miller fence, long collapsed from years of neglect, and followed the trail to nowhere in particular. His breathing grew heavier, and his boots stumbled more often than they landed. Eventually he crested another small ridge. Below, hidden behind a grove of dying oak, sat a lonely ranch house. It was plain and weathered, with a split-rail fence that struggled to stand upright, and a single porch light flickering like a heartbeat in the darkening dusk. No smoke rose from the chimney. No sound echoed from its halls. But something about it pulled at him, a shape he remembered, a rhythm of silence he somehow recognized. His steps faltered as he reached the gate. A wooden sign swung loosely from one nail, bearing the name Willow Ridge. The letters were faded, nearly lost to time. He placed one trembling hand on the gatepost, the other on the latch. But he didn't open it. His knees buckled before he could decide. The gate rattled softly as he collapsed just outside it, face first into the dust. The silence of the evening swallowed him whole. Birds stopped singing. The wind held its breath. Only the steady flicker of the porch light remained, blinking into the dark, waiting. Inside the house, behind a curtain drawn halfway, a woman stood perfectly still. She had seen him fall. But she didn't rush out. Not yet. She reached for her shawl. If you're drawn to stories where heartbreak meets the dust of the frontier, where love grows from loss, stay with me. Because this story, it doesn't end the way you think. The woman behind the curtain didn't blink. She had seen the man stumble, seen the way his body crumpled into the dust like a structure losing its last support beam. He hadn't even tried to knock. Just dropped, right there at her gate. For a long minute, she stood motionless, her hand gripping the edge of the faded curtain. The wind pulled at the edges of the window pane, whispering secrets she no longer cared to hear. Her name was Evelyn Hart, 32 years old. Widow of a man named Raymond Hart, a rancher with fire in his chest and bullets in his past. 5 years ago, he rode off to defend a claim dispute down near Tumble Creek. By the time she got the telegram, his body had already been in the ground for 2 days, buried under a crooked wooden cross no one carved his name into. Evelyn had inherited the ranch he'd once called his life's work, acres of fertile land, a stone well, 2 horses too old to ride, and a house that creaked more than it spoke. To anyone passing by, it might have looked like a dream. But to her it was a graveyard wearing a fence. She didn't farm it. She didn't sell it. She didn't invite company, nor did she join the Sunday folk down in Drybell. She kept to herself, chopping her own firewood, milking a half-blind goat, and surviving in the house where every floorboard still creaked his name. Some days she walked the fields just to remind herself she still had legs. Other days she just sat on the porch and watched shadows lengthen across the barn. And now, a man lay unconscious at her gate. Evelyn stepped away from the window, wrapping the shawl tighter around her shoulders. Her boots made soft thuds on the wooden floor as she crossed the room. She opened the front door slowly as though afraid the sight would vanish. But he was still there, slumped on his side, hat half buried in dust, one boot hanging off his heel. "Lord have mercy," she muttered under her breath. Her first instinct was to leave him. Let the coyotes decide his fate. This wasn't the kind of land that offered sanctuary for every broken soul passing through. But something in his posture, the way he hadn't reached for the latch, hadn't begged for entry, it pulled at something buried deep in her, something she had long assumed was gone. She stepped down from the porch and knelt beside him, brushing back his hat to get a better look. His face was gaunt, sun-beaten, with a few days' worth of dust and hunger crusting his lips. His shirt was torn near the shoulder, not from violence but from wear. And his eyes, closed but not peacefully, like a man too exhausted to carry pain any further. "Idiot," she whispered. "You'll die out here." With effort that surprised even her, she hooked her arms beneath his and began dragging him toward the house. The porch steps groaned in protest, and twice she nearly lost her grip. But she got him inside inch by inch until he was lying on the woven rug beside the hearth. She propped his head up on a folded blanket and fetched water from the pitcher. When she brought the tin cup to his lips, he didn't drink it first. But after a moment his throat moved, slow, dry swallows. He didn't open his eyes. Evelyn sat back on her heels, catching her breath. "Well, you're not dead," she muttered. "Not yet." She watched him for a while, unsure what came next. The fire was low, so she added another log. The kettle had boiled over an hour ago, but she poured a fresh pot anyway. Her hands moved out of habit, slicing bread, ladling broth into a chipped bowl, things she hadn't done for anyone else in years. When she returned to his side, the scent of food stirred him slightly. He didn't wake, but a quiet sound escaped his throat, not a word, more like a sigh that remembered warmth. Evelyn looked at him, really looked this time. Not as a threat, not as a drifter, but as a man. A man who had walked farther than most ever dared. Who had arrived not asking, not taking, just falling. And that was something she understood. Maybe better than she wanted to. That night she let him stay. Not on her bed, of course, that hadn't been slept in by anyone but her in 5 long years. But she set out a second blanket, pulled the rug closer to the fire, and placed a tin of water near his hand should he wake. Then she sat in her rocking chair and watched the flames flicker low. The wind knocked gently at the shutters. The old house breathed its tired rhythm. She didn't ask his name. He hadn't offered it. But before she blew out the last lantern, she said softly to the room, "You don't get to die here. Not on my floor." And for the first time in many years, the ranch felt like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what the morning would bring. Mornings came cold and dry, the kind that turned breath to mist and made the floorboards groan underfoot. He was still there when she woke, not dead, not gone, just sitting upright on the rug near the hearth, legs crossed, eyes half focused on the dying embers. He hadn't touched the bread she left him, but the water tin was empty. Evelyn stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the parlor, arms folded across her chest, studying him like one might study a strange dog left by the porch. She said nothing. Neither did he. The quiet settled thick between them. By midday he was outside. No words, no gesture of thanks, just movement. He'd found the broom by the door and swept the porch clean. Then he picked up the broken hinge on the gate and repaired it with a bent nail he scavenged from the barn. Evelyn watched him from the kitchen window, her fingers frozen around a mug of bitter coffee. He didn't move like a thief or a beggar. He moved like a man who needed to fix something, anything, just to feel real again. He stayed that night too. She didn't ask him to. Didn't offer, didn't protest. He simply came in after sunset, removed his boots by the door, and laid the blanket out beside the fire. She noticed the way he tucked the edges in, precise and deliberate, as if he were used to sleeping on cold ground and needed the routine to sleep at all. He still hadn't said a word. On the third morning, Evelyn left a tin of biscuits on the table, along with a small plate of fried eggs. When she came back in from feeding the goat, she found the tin empty and the dishes rinsed in the basin. There was a single clean cup beside the stove, filled with water meant for her. She stared at it a long while before picking it up. Later that day she caught him mending the fence on the north pasture. The rails were cracked and sagging, and she'd long since given up trying to keep the boundary from falling in. But there he was, sleeves rolled, hands raw, measuring each beam like it meant something. She approached slowly, boots crunching over frostbitten grass. "You plan on staying long?" she asked. He paused, hand on the post, then shook his head just once. She waited. No answer came. "Suit yourself," she muttered, turning back toward the house. But her voice lacked the sharpness it once had. It was harder to be angry with someone who didn't fight back. Days passed like that, in the rhythm of quiet work and unspoken patterns. He rose early, often before her, and took on small chores without being asked. The kind of things a man did when he had nothing else to offer. Chopping wood, sweeping the stable, checking the roofline for leaks. At night, he would sit by the fire while Evelyn read by lamplight, both of them wrapped in their own silence. It was a strange kind of comfort. Not warmth exactly, but a mutual understanding that neither of them needed to fill the space with words. Still, the not knowing gnawed at her. Who he was. Why he walked into her land and didn't leave. Why he moved like someone carrying the ghost of something he couldn't shake. She didn't press. But she watched. One evening, a storm rolled low over the horizon, dark clouds boiling across the ridge. Evelyn lit the lantern early and double-checked the shutters. The air inside was thick with tension, not from danger, but from the stillness that always came before the sky broke. The cowboy sat near the fire again, sharpening a blade that had long since lost its edge. She poured them both a cup of whiskey, not out of kindness but out of some half-remembered ritual. 2 glasses. 1 fire. No words. He accepted the cup with a nod. Their fingers brushed. Just barely. As the thunder cracked in the distance, Evelyn finally asked, "You ever seen a sky like this?" He looked at her, not startled, not cold, just slow. Measured. His gaze held the weight of buried things. "I used to know land like this," he said. It was the first sentence he'd spoken since arriving. Evelyn froze. The storm outside no longer seemed loud. The rain hadn't started yet, but her heartbeat had. She watched him for signs, for a flicker of pain, for tears he'd never let fall. But there was only that quiet, heavy statement hanging between them. "You used to?" she asked softly, unsure if she should prod. He didn't answer. He sipped the whiskey slowly and looked into the fire like it knew the rest of the story. She didn't ask more. Not yet. But that night, after the storm broke and rain lashed the windows, she didn't go to her room. She sat beside the hearth, just close enough to hear his breathing slow as he drifted to sleep. And when he turned onto his side, facing her even in rest, she didn't turn away. The silence between them had changed. It wasn't just emptiness anymore. It was something beginning. The wind started howling before noon. Not the soft kind that rustled wheat fields and whispered lullabies through old windows. This wind came low and fast, the kind that warned of something breaking. Evelyn stood at the barn's edge, staring up at the sky. It had turned a sickly gray, bruised at the edges. The horses were restless, their nostrils flaring with a panic that hadn't reached her yet. But it would. She could feel it in her bones. The storm was coming. She turned to the cowboy who was up on the ladder checking the roofline again. He moved like always, steady, focused, hands busy, but something about his stillness made her chest tighten. It wasn't just the storm that made her uneasy. It was the look in his eyes that morning. Distant. Like he was already gone. "You should stay inside tonight," she said, trying to keep her voice even. He didn't answer. Just nodded and kept hammering down the loose panel. By sundown the sky had turned black. The first lightning bolt cracked across the hills, followed by thunder that rolled so deep it shook the kitchen window panes. Evelyn lit every lantern she had, setting them in corners of the room like small soldiers against the dark. The fire roared in the hearth, but it didn't feel warm. It felt like a last defense. He sat in the same chair by the fire, his cup of coffee untouched. She watched him from across the room, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. For hours they didn't speak. The wind screamed louder. Rain hammered the roof in waves. Somewhere out in the dark, a branch snapped violently, then silence, then more wind. It sounded like the whole world was tearing at the edges. Evelyn tried to focus on her stitching, but her fingers wouldn't stop trembling. Not from the cold. From something deeper, something familiar. Storms had a way of waking old ghosts. "You ever leave in the middle of one?" she asked suddenly, her voice low. He looked up. "What?" She swallowed. "A storm. You ever just walk away from something in the middle of a storm?" He didn't answer right away. Just stared into the fire for a long moment. Then finally, "I've walked away in all kinds of weather." The words hit harder than she expected. Her breath caught. She tried to laugh, but it cracked before it formed. Figures. She stood up too quickly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. She walked to the window, watching the rain smear across the glass in frantic strokes. Her reflection stared back, pale, rigid, older than she remembered. The wind rattled the frame, and she pressed her palm against the cold wood to steady herself. "I don't care if you go," she said, voice louder now. "I don't. You can leave whenever you like. I didn't ask you to stay." Still he said nothing. She turned, her eyes sharp with something between anger and sorrow. "You think you're the only one who's lost something out here? You think you're the only one who's been left behind?" His jaw tightened, but he stayed seated, letting her words whip through the room like the wind outside. "I've buried the only man I ever loved. I've spent 5 winters in this house with no one to talk to but ghosts. Every piece of furniture in this place belonged to someone who ain't coming back." Her voice broke. "So don't think for a second that I can't handle being alone." She looked down at her feet. The storm growled louder, pressing against the walls like it wanted inside. Then, softer, so soft it almost vanished into the thunder, she said it. "You can have my land, just don't leave me." The room went silent. Even the fire seemed to dim, as if startled by the weight of her voice. She didn't look up. Couldn't. Her hands were shaking again, so she gripped the edge of the windowsill to anchor herself. Behind her the chair creaked. She heard him stand. 1 step. Then 2. The air between them stretched thin like a fraying rope. When he finally spoke, it wasn't what she expected. "I don't want your land." She turned, slowly, her heart thudding against her ribs. He stood just a few feet away now, eyes shadowed but steady. His voice was low, even. "I've had land. I've had barns and fences and cattle. None of it kept the world from falling apart." Evelyn blinked, unsure what part of her to hold together. He stepped closer. "You think I stayed because I wanted something from you?" She didn't answer. Couldn't find words that didn't crumble. "I stayed," he said, "because this house breathes like mine used to. Because you don't talk unless it matters. Because I forgot what it felt like to wake up somewhere and not hate the sky." The wind shrieked again, but Evelyn no longer heard it. He didn't touch her. Didn't promise anything. He just stood there with her in the storm, not outside it, not above it, but inside it, where both of them belonged. That night he didn't sleep on the floor. He didn't ask for a bed either. He just sat in the rocker across from her, boots off, hat in his lap, the fire casting long shadows on the walls. She didn't read. She didn't stitch. She just sat with him in the hush of the storm, both of them too tired to keep pretending they were strangers. And for the first time in a long while, Evelyn didn't feel abandoned. She felt seen. The days after the storm rolled on like the hush of a long-held breath. The rain had passed, but its memory lingered in the wet soil and the quiet that followed. The cowboy didn't pack his things. He didn't head back to the road or return to the saloon as most drifters might have. He simply stayed, like a man who no longer needed to outrun his past. And that was when something shifted, not loudly or suddenly, but softly, like morning mist lifting from the valley. He began to rise with the sun, long before she did, and by the time she'd step outside with her shawl clutched tight, he'd already be in the field, mending a fence, checking the water line, leading the mule with slow, steady hands. He didn't ask for instructions, didn't wait to be told, as if he already understood the land, as if he could hear what it needed just by listening to the wind. She watched him from the porch, arms folded, her coffee going cold in her hands. He had become part of the land in a way she never could, not since her husband was buried beneath it. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful. Necessary. They'd share simple meals together, cornbread, beans, slices of dried venison, eaten by the crackle of the hearth. Sometimes he'd nod at her cooking with a soft grunt of approval. Other times she'd refill his cup before he asked. There were no grand gestures, no sudden declarations. But something was blooming between them like wildflowers after a long drought. It was care in its purest form, shown through actions, not words. Neighbors began to notice. A couple passing in a wagon tipped their hats. A boy selling eggs brought an extra dozen. Word spread, though no one dared say anything outright. They were still strangers in each other's lives, but somehow not strangers anymore. She started hanging laundry with a lighter step. He started humming under his breath when he thought no one was listening. One afternoon she caught him smoothing the ground near the barn, fixing the spot where her husband's boots had once worn the earth bare. She opened her mouth to say something, maybe to ask why, but stopped. The truth was she didn't want to know. Maybe it was his way of honoring the past. Maybe it was his way of healing it. Either way, she let him do it. That night, he left his coat on the hook inside the door instead of the post outside. She noticed. She said nothing. He never brought up the land again. Never once mentioned the offer she had made in the rain, the desperation in her voice when she told him not to leave. And she didn't either. Not because she regretted it, but because somehow, it no longer felt necessary. She had offered it because she was afraid of being alone. But now, even without papers or promises, he was still here. That meant more than any deed or title could ever prove. On the day she found a broken wheelbarrow left upright and freshly patched beside the shed, something in her chest cracked open, not painfully but warmly. He had fixed it without asking. Just like he fixed everything else. Quietly. Steadily. Day after day. Not because he had to, but because he chose to. That night, as they sat by the fire, she poured him an extra glass of whiskey and smiled. Not the smile of politeness, but the kind you give someone when you see them. Really see them. She didn't tell him she loved him. And he didn't tell her either. But in the hush between words, in the scrape of chairs pulled side by side, in the sound of two boots thudding against the floor as they relaxed in front of the flames, the truth sat with them like an old friend. It didn't need a name. Winter came early that year. The first frost brushed the fields with silver. The animals grew thick coats. The nights lengthened. And still he stayed. He chopped wood without being asked. He repaired the leak in the barn roof. He led her horse to water when her back ached. She sewed a new lining into his coat. On a morning when the wind howled harder than it had in weeks, she stood at the kitchen window and saw him out in the distance, hat pulled low, shoulders broad against the cold, guiding the cattle across the far ridge. The sight took her breath away. Not because it was heroic, but because it was ordinary. And that was what made it beautiful. He was here. Every day. In the small ways that mattered most. She had given him her land once, in a moment of fear. But he never claimed it, never signed a thing. He didn't have to. What he gave her in return was something far rarer than ownership or contracts or security. He gave her time. He gave her presence. He gave her peace. And when neighbors asked, when the preacher stopped by and tilted his head with curiosity, she would only say this: "He's the man who stayed." Because that was all they needed to know. And more than she ever dreamed she'd have again.